seated. If you want to follow on Actual Bible, we're going to go to Exodus and then move around a bit. It was so good to be with you tonight. Thanks for being so hospitable. This next session is going to be a slightly shorter. I would aim to be done at 8:30, and the reason is because I want to honor your time. And if you're in this room and you're over 40, I know, I get it. But we don't do things outside after 7. Like seriously, like if once you turn 40, like it's like weird. It's like I've had people, I travel the world, people say, hey, you want to go to a movie or something? I'm like, what time's the movie start? They're like 7:45. I'm like, what am I, an animal? Like, are you serious? That'd be 8, then it'd be 9. I won't be home till like 10, 12. Are you kidding me? Right? So I get it. I do. I'm 45. I get it. Right? So 8:30 will be done. I want to talk to you about salvation. And I know I said earlier I wasn't going to come as an evangelist. I'm still not. I do want to talk to you about salvation because words matter less than how we picture words functioning. And so sometimes the word salvation, it brings up all kinds of connotations to it. Like in some ways it's sort of, like when you hear people talk about, are they saved, or are they the unsaved, right? You're like, oh, can we not talk about people like that? Like, it's like, is it really us and them? And sometimes people talk about salvation in the sense of only one-dimensional, like someday. So sometimes salvation is this someday, the lion and the lamb. Someday no more pain. Someday no more crying. And amen. We embrace that. Like, we embrace resurrection. We embrace that. But salvation is much more multi-dimensional than that. And I want to talk to you about one of those dimensions. And it's not the someday dimension, it's the here, now, today dimension. This is Colossians. If you could chuck that first one up there. This is Paul trying to explain the meaning of the cross to the first century people. Now, the first 10 minutes of this talk, I sent to Church on the Rise during the COVID lockdown. So if you watched it as a part of something they showed, I reserve the right to repeat myself without you going, boo! Right? You've already heard this, right? But because I think it bears repeating. It says, when you were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. He forgave us all our sins. So I want to give that its 10 seconds of due. That the cross is about the forgiveness of sins. I actually think it's even better than the idea that Jesus died to forgive us. I think Jesus died to show us we were always forgiven. Wow. Like it's 6 different places by 4 different authors. It says that the truth of the cross of Jesus Christ was true before the foundation of the world. In other words, you wouldn't believe it without seeing it. So God fixed the whole thing before it started. You wouldn't believe it without seeing it. So He went so far to show you, right? So in other words, Jesus didn't just die to fix a problem. Jesus died to obliterate the idea there ever was a problem, right? Or we can say it this way: Jesus didn't die to change God's mind about you. Jesus died to change your mind about God. Like God is like Jesus, exactly like Jesus. He'd always been like Jesus. We did not know that, but now we do, right? So there's this beautiful part of the cross that we acknowledge, we actually embrace, we affirm, and it deserves its own 40-minute talk. It does, but not right now, right? Having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us, He took it away by nailing it to the cross. I want to talk about the next line. Next slide. And having disarmed the powers and authorities, He made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. In other words, one part of the cross was about the forgiveness of sins. Yes, amen, embrace it. But the other part of the cross was about God being determined to do an in-your-face confrontation to whatever's oppressing you here, now, today. Now, if we are to be a community of the cross, we can't simply be about the forgiveness of sins only, although we should be about that. We should also be people who are determined to confront oppression and set people free here, now, today. Because that is what God is about. Remember, words matter less than how we picture words functioning. So, there's a way you can say something that's true, but the imagination it creates is not very good. I'll give you a great example, okay? What I'm fixing to say is absolutely true. Jesus is the judge. True? True. Yeah. Here's the problem, is the imagination it creates. So if I was to ask people, when I say Jesus is the judge, what do you picture? The number one answer by a country mile, like by a long way, is I picture a judge. I picture a judicial officer declaring people guilty or not guilty. Here's the problem with that. The Hebrew word for judge is shofet, which isn't a judicial officer at all. It's someone anointed by God to set people free from what's oppressing them. And you know that to be true on the inside. Why? Because there's an entire book in the Old Testament called the book of Judges. Are they judicial officers? No. They're people anointed by God to set people free from whatever's oppressing them. So there's a way we could say something true, like Jesus is the judge, and the picture it creates is not healthy. Because the next thing we do is we say, come on folks, press in, get close to Jesus. Nobody want to be in court? Even if you're innocent, you don't want to be in court. But if we build the image of Jesus as the judge in the biblical sense, like Jesus is the person anointed by God to set us free from what oppresses us, that is a whole different thing. And you see this idea, and as far as I know, the first mention of the word salvation in the whole Bible. Let me show it to you. This is in Exodus. Next slide. In Exodus chapter 3. And the Lord said, I've indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt, and I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I'm concerned about their suffering. So I'm going to come down and rescue them. Now, in this context, is salvation about the forgiveness of sins? No, it's about God not being able to take one more second of something oppressing us, and He is going to do whatever He can do to rescue us. The word rescue there is the same word we get the word salvation from. So is salvation about the forgiveness of sins? Yes, it is. But it's also about God's intentional effort to rescue people from whatever is oppressing them. So there is a forgiveness element of salvation, and then there's like a freedom element of salvation. There's a someday element of salvation, but there's also a here, now, today element of salvation. Now, to understand this, let's remind ourselves, who was this written to? Slaves in Egypt. Jewish, Israelite, slaves in Egypt were crying out because of their suffering. Remember that. Now, to understand this, we got to go all the way back to the beginning. This is Genesis chapter 2. Next slide. So Genesis chapter 2 is early on in the biblical narratives. And this interesting thing happens in the Genesis poem. This is what it says. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden, and it was separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first was called Bashan, and it winded through the entire land of Havilah where there is gold. And the gold is perfect. What an odd sentence. There's a river called Bashan. It's winding through the entire land of Havilah. And by the way, there's gold in the river. And it's not just any gold, it's perfect gold. What a strange sort of thing. So let's sort of break these ideas down. Because to understand what's going on here, at least literarily, you got to sort of know this. Next slide. So the Hebrew word Bashan is translated hope. It's actually even deeper than that. Ancient Hebrew was written in pictures because they came out of Egypt. It was hieroglyphs. So every Hebrew letter is a picture. Every Hebrew word is a comic strip. So the word Bashan actually has these pictures of like something appears dead or dormant, and then it bursts forth with life. The best way I could explain it is we thought that volcano was extinct, and suddenly it's rumbling with life. You could translate that hope. You could translate that surprise. You could translate that resurrection. Like, it's interesting. In ancient Hebrew, the word for resurrection and the word for surprise are the same word, right? And that shouldn't be a surprise. Why? Because in your experience, dead people stay dead, right? So like if you saw me die, and then 3 days later I saw you at Woolworths and said hello, surprise, sort of cuts it, right? So hope, surprise. Let's go with hope, though. Havilah is the word for suffering. So what the story's saying is that there's a river called Hope, and it's winding through the entire land of suffering. In other words, if you're in the land of suffering, there's a river called Hope flowing somewhere in it. You just got to go find it, right? The problem is there's lots of rivers in the land of suffering. There's a river called Give Up, Sell Out, Compromise, Make Matters Worse. You don't want those. You want the river of hope. And then the author says, and you can always, if you could back up just for a second, thank you. You could always know you found the river of hope because there's gold in the riverbed. Now, once again, there's all this. It's Wednesday night, you're in church. I'm going to do a little bit deeper things here that I couldn't do on normal occasions. So the word gold in Hebrew has 3 letters, 3 pictures: an eyeball, a person harvesting supply, and a house, or a house of God. So when an ancient Hebrew person read the word gold, they read, "Behold, the one who brings us substance for survival brings it to us in the house of God." Wow. Right? So there's hope flowing through suffering. It gets better. So there was a scientist in Perth that explained this to me, and then he showed me. His name was Lance. He was a cool guy. If you take perfect gold, not like hard gold, but if you take perfect gold, all it takes is 1 part of perfect gold to 100,000 parts of water, and it'll turn all the water blood red. It's how they make stained glass, because once you get red, you can do all kinds of things to it. He actually took me to this thing, and he showed me. He gave me a little vial with like just 1/10 of a billionth of a gram of perfect gold in this vial of water, and it looked like a blood sample. If I was ever going to preach on this, I used to carry it around with me. I'd stand at the door and say, "Hi, welcome to church, I'm glad you're here." And I would just hold it. And somebody always would say, "Why are you carrying a blood sample around?" It looked exactly like that. One time I was landing in a plane, the pressure changed, it exploded, there it went. But so I've actually seen it. So I want you to think about this, right? If the river of hope that's winding through suffering has perfect gold in the riverbed, what color would the river be? It would be red. So the summary of Genesis chapter 2 would be this. Next slide. There's a river called hope, and it's winding through the entire land of suffering. Because behold, the one who brings the substance for survival brings it to us in the house of God through a river of blood. So in their world, when water turns to blood, it means hope is flowing through their suffering. Fast forward to Egypt. I've indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. And I'm concerned about their suffering. So I'm going to say them. Think through your Sunday school Bible stories. How does God deliver the Israelites from Egypt? Through a series of 10 plagues. What was the first plague? All the water turns to blood. Right. To the Egyptians, that was a curse. To the Hebrew people, there would have been a buzz in their camp. Hey, did you hear? All the water's turning red. Hope flows through suffering. Moses gets them out of Egypt by walking them through the Red Sea. Hope flows through suffering. Red water. Hope flows through suffering. They end up at Mount Sinai. They build a gold cow. Moses loses the plot and beats the gold cow into powder. And he makes them throw the gold powder into the water coming out of the rock. Well, if they throw the gold in the water, what color does it come? Red. And he makes them drink it for the redemption of their sins. Hope flows through suffering. This is even evident in creation. I've never seen anybody give birth. I don't have any children. I've never witnessed it. What I understand about it, it's a hectic thing. It takes a lot of effort to get life from here to out. And here's what I do know. This is how basic my knowledge of childbirth is. It comes all from TV, because if you want facts, well, it's on TV. A woman's water breaks. And she'll go, "Oh, my water broke." And then she'll enter into a time of labor, or suffering. And in labor, what two fluids mix together? Blood and water. So then the greatest suffering a woman might ever know, out comes a bundle of joy. When blood and water come together, hope and suffering. So the Christian worldview is never one that doesn't make a place for suffering. It's not like, hey, we have enough faith to never suffer. It's just that the suffering never gets the last word. There's a resurrection coming from the dead. Right? Oh, years later, there's this guy named Jesus. And he shows up at a wedding in Cana. And he does his first miracle. What was his first miracle? He turns all the water into wine. Yeah. What was his point? Was it to provide adult beverages for the party? Oh, there's something deeper going on there. These people are oppressed under the slavery and the authority of Rome. And he shows up to this oppressed group of people, and he makes all the water turn red. What would they have heard? Oh, we're in the land of suffering now, but hope is flowing. Remember on the last and greatest day of the feast, he stands on the temple steps. And what were they doing? They were doing the water and wine ceremony, where the priest would pour water and wine onto the altar until it overflowed, and then it would go. So this mix of blood and water was flowing between the people. And remember what Jesus does? He stands up and says, "I am the living water." In other words, the hope that's supposed to flow through suffering, that the temple's been promising you for years and never delivering, I am here to save the day. Hope flows through suffering. Years later, Jesus is having a pretty bad day. And he ends up on a cross. Right? I think we could all agree together it's a bad day. Right? And they want to make sure he's dead. So they take a spear and they stick it in his side. And the gospel writers say what? Out of his side came a steady flow of what? Blood and water. In Jewish thought, what is that saying? It's saying that at the foot of the cross is not just the forgiveness of sins. It's a river of hope flowing through suffering. That hope flows through suffering. That the cross of Jesus Christ and salvation is not simply about the forgiveness of sins. It is also about God's intention to do in-your-face confrontations to whatever is oppressing you. And if you go back and look at the God revealed in Jesus and just read the stories, And instead of looking for doctrines or ways to go to heaven, which we embrace, right? But Jesus never once ever said, hey, I want you to say this prayer so you can go to heaven when you die. Jesus' invitation was more profound than that. It was, have heaven so established in you today that when you do go into heaven, you don't get whiplash. Right? The idea isn't do something here so you can go somewhere else. It's have heaven established in you now so that when you do walk into heaven, it's like, oh yeah, we've been living like this for a while. This is, tables with every tribe, tongue, and race, that's us. Are you kidding me? That's what we've been about all along. You see, Jesus, if you go back and read Jesus and the way he lived and the way he saw the world, and actually what churches are supposed to be are not people who believe in Jesus. Demons believe in Jesus, whatever. It's church people are supposed to be people who don't just believe in Jesus, but allow Jesus' way of seeing the world to fundamentally shape the way they see their whole world. And if you go back and read the Jesus stories, and just ask yourself this question, how many times was he doing an in-your-face confrontation to oppression? Like how many times was he, I'll give you, there's this one time. He has an encounter with a tax collector up a tree, right? Zacchaeus was the guy's name. And it says, Zacchaeus, I got this huge crowd, but I'm going to tell them to hold on because I want to come eat with you. And it says Zacchaeus was so moved by the compassion of Jesus, he said, look, I'll give half of what I have to the poor. And what did Jesus say? That's it. Salvation has come to this house. Is Jesus allowed to do that? Okay. If I ask you if Jesus is allowed to do something, the answer is yes. All right, so let's practice that. Is Jesus allowed to do that?
Yes.
So can Jesus call someone saved because they gave half what they had to the poor?
Yes.
No temple visit, no altar call, no sacrifice, no sinner's prayer, no Romans 10, 9, and 10. I know it surprises some people that people got saved before the book of Romans was written, but they did. And think about it. In the first century, what was the only way for Zacchaeus to be saved? Temple ritual. Who's not allowed in the temple? Tax collectors. So when your job forbidded you from going to the only place salvation was available, what do? Jesus circumvents the entire system of oppressive power, and he sees the man's heart change, and he goes, that's enough for me. That is an in-your-face confrontation to the oppression that was over these people. There's this one time. It says that Jesus goes to a prostitute's house. Right? Is Jesus allowed to do that?
Yes.
And without being rude, what was going on at a prostitute's house in the first century? Business. Which leads to this question. Would there be a worse place to ever run into Jesus? Imagine that. Imagine being the guy in the back room, like Jesus is between customers, and the guy's like, go, Jesus! Hey, man. And it says the prostitute was so moved by his compassion that she knelt down and wiped his feet with her hair. And what does Jesus say? That's it. All your sins are now forgiven. Is Jesus allowed to do that?
Yes.
Can you get your sins forgiven by wiping his feet with your hair?
Yes.
And aren't you glad that's not the rule? Like for all my bald brothers in the room? Right? With all respect to you all and myself, for us to wipe Jesus' feet with our hair would be a three-man job. We'd have to be turned upside down and used like a buffer. See, people tend to say, Jesus is the only way. Okay, but saying Jesus is the only way and saying my way to Jesus is the only way to Jesus, that's two different things. What you find is Jesus meaning, what was the only way for the prostitute to be saved in the first century? Temple ritual. Who's not allowed in the temple? Yeah. So Jesus circumvents the entire system of oppressive power, and he sees her heart change and says, that's enough for me. Meets her the rest of the way. This is in-your-face confrontations to an entire way. Maybe the most confronting one is it says there's this one time that Jesus was preaching in a full house, and it was so full that people couldn't get in anymore, and there was a paralyzed guy who couldn't get in because the crowd was too full. So his friends take him up to the roof, cut a hole in the roof, and lower him down. Remember that story? Yeah. That is the single most chaotic scene in Jesus' whole... I don't care how good of a communicator you are. If someone repels from the roof, you can't hold the crowd. I'm a decent communicator. If a bird flew in here, it'd be over. Right? Remember what it says? This guy comes down from the roof. And it says, and Jesus saw the faith of his friends and proclaimed his sins forgiven. Is Jesus allowed to do that?
Yes.
What was the only way for that man to be saved in the first century? Temple ritual. Who's not allowed in the temple? Paralyzed people. Jesus circumvents the entire system of oppressive power, and he goes, God, whatever you're thinking about God, God is nicer than you think. It's in your face sort of stuff. Jesus was a radical, compassionate, pretty cool character that was against the elite harboring God for themselves, and he was for setting oppressed people free. But perhaps the story that illustrates that the best is my least favorite story in the whole Bible for most of my life. It's a story that's so horrible that in one edition of the NIV, at the bottom of the page, in the smallest print known to man, there's an asterisk that says, we're not sure this should even be in there. It is a horrible story. It's in John chapter 5. I'm not going to read it. You'll be familiar with it when I tell you what it is. It's a story about a pool called Bethesda. I'm not going to read the story. I'll tell the story. I'll tell it well. This is essentially the basics of the story. There was a pool called Bethesda inside the sheep gate in Jerusalem, and occasionally an angel would stir the water of the pool of Bethesda, and the first person in would get healed and no one else. Now, for those of you who know the story, is that a fair summary? Okay. Is anybody okay with that story? That is horrible! This is what that makes God sound like. God's in heaven somewhere going, I'm bored. I don't have enough to do. Angel, get over here. I got a job. This is going to be fun. Hey, get over here. Hey, you see that pool down there? It's called Bethesda. Here's what I want you to do. Only when I tell you, and only when I tell you, I want you to take your finger, I want you to stir the water in the pool of Bethesda. And only the first person in gets healed, and no one else. We'll successfully create a race amongst afflicted people, because nothing gets my God heart beating like a bunch of crippled people trying to move fast. This is going to be amazing. And there's some like bookie in heaven going, 20 to win 80, 20 to win 80, 300 to 1 on that guy. That guy's got no legs, 3,000 to 1, right? It's a horrible story. And you've likely never heard a sermon on it. The reason is because it's the one passage that pastors hope no one asks about. Like, what do you do with that story? It's frankly awful. Then Jesus shows up and makes it worse. He walks up to a guy that's been there 38 years. His legs don't work. 38 years, that's a long time. I was in second grade 38 years ago. It's a long time. If you're not 38 years old, you don't know what that is. 38 years, sitting by the pool, with his legs paralyzed. And Jesus, if you remove your Jesus goggles, Jesus is like sarcastic. He's like, what's the matter, bro? The water don't work for you? And remember the guy who has the paralyzed legs? He's like, but Rabbi, you know the rules. Only the first one in gets healed. And the guy with a sore throat, he's sort of a jerk. He always jumps in first. And I'm talking like, mate, I've been here 38 years. Can we take a number? No, it's not working. It's an awful story, actually. Until in 2014, I was invited to study in Jerusalem with a top history expert. It's a PhD level, he teaches PhD level ancient history at the university there in Jerusalem. He heard me do something, he called me and invited me to Jerusalem to study with him and to speak at his Messianic synagogue. And this blew me away. We're walking by. I was disoriented. I wouldn't have known where we were. And we walked by the pool of Bethesda. Here's how nonchalant he was about the pool of Bethesda. He went, yeah, that's the pool of Bethesda. And then just started to walk away. Now, he always told me I could ask questions, so I thought, oh boy. Now, words matter less than our imagination of how words work, okay? When I retold the story of John chapter 5 in the pool of Bethesda, or when you've read it yourself, every person, if you're paying attention, has an imagination of what the pool is. And I want you to think about your imagination right now. And I'll tell you what mine was. My thought of the pool of Bethesda was that it was about the size of this room. And that it was about 2 foot deep. The reason is because crippled people were trying to jump in it. Can't be very deep. And it really can't be that big. I couldn't have been more wrong. He said, yeah, that's the pool of Bethesda. Let me show you a picture of the pool of Bethesda. The reason this is such a good picture is because I took it myself. Let me show it to you next slide. That's the pool of Bethesda. Photographers everywhere are trying to get strangers' hands in the top of their photo. Top left. I pulled it off. Get you some of that. This is the pool of Bethesda, and the lights are a bit bright on it, but that's okay. It's 100 meters long, by 30 meters wide, by 40 foot deep. To give you some perspective, on the top right is a bridge across the pool of Bethesda, and that is a grown man walking across the bridge. Which totally wrecked my imagination of what the pool of Bethesda was, right? So I said to him, "Mate, is this the pool of Bethesda?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Make sure I got my story straight. Angel stirs the water, first person in gets healed, no one else dies." He said, "Yes." He said, "What's your question?" I said, excuse me, how many people died here?" He said, "What?" I said, "Follow me, like, so you're crippled, right? And you're sitting by that, and someone says, 'Angel stirring the water!' And you're like, 'Oh!' Right? And you don't work out till you're in the water that you're number 2. Right? You're so gone, bro. He looked at me like I had 9 heads. Here was his exact words. "You're joking. Everybody knows this." Which was a little disconcerting, because follow my logic here. If everybody knows this and I don't know it, that literally makes me the dumbest person on earth on that topic. So I tried to play along. I was like, yeah, man. Why don't you let me in on what it is everybody knows? And he said, "You really don't know?" I said, "No. I'm so embarrassed." I am. I'm humiliated, actually, but I don't know. He said, "Then we got to talk about this, because if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, that would make God awful." I said, "Yes." And he asked me one question. What God was ruling Jerusalem when Jesus walked the earth? And the answer was the Roman Caesars. There was upwards of 40 pagan gods in Jerusalem alone in Jesus' day. There was Attis, Adonis, Horus, Amun-Ra in the south, the goat god Pan in the north, Dionysus, Mithra. Second question he asked me is, he said, "You didn't think the angel in John chapter 5 was the angel of our God, did you?" I said, it crossed my mind. He said, "What? No way." He said, "Bethesda is a pagan headquarters of the Greek god of healing, Serapis." He said, "Shame. Are there people in this world that think it's the angel of our God?" I said, "There's a few." Mostly Kiwis. Mostly the New Zealand. And he told me the story. He said, "Where you're standing is the ruins of the temple of the goat god. That's Pan in the north. It's the ruins of the temple of Serapis, the Greek god of healing." He said, and this big pool was their front yard. He said that big pool would overflow. So the Roman officials said, "You got to create a catchment pool to keep water from going into the city, because it was all dirt. You create mud, and it's horrible." He said, "So if you just turn around right now, it's the catchment pool. And picture there's this huge building between the big pool and the small pool." Let me show you a picture of the small pool. Again, it's a great photo because I took it myself. Next slide. So this is the small pool. And it's about what I pictured. It's it's probably twice the size of this room. It's the size of this room if you remove that wall. It's about 2 foot deep. It's got columns and places to sit. It's quite cool. He said what would happen is when the big pool was starting to overflow, they would pull a lever and it would move water underneath the temple to the small pool to keep it from overflowing. He said if you think about that, when the big pool moved water to the small pool, it would make the small pool bubble. And so the Roman officials talked to the priest of Serapis and said, "What if we told people that it's an angel of Serapis stirring the water. And since Serapis is the god of healing, the first one in gets healed and no one else does. And the crippled and afflicted people will pay us a premium to sit the closest to the pool. The priest of Serapis said, well, that's fine, but no one's going to actually get healed. And the way they did it is they used a plant. They would take someone who pretended to be sick. They would tell him when that was going to happen. He would always be the first one in the pool. He would then walk out miraculously, which only exacerbated the men. And so by the time Jesus was walking the earth, this had been going on for over 60 years. And by the time Jesus was walking the earth, you had poor and afflicted people paying every month the Roman Empire for the right to sit closest to that pool for the hope that they might get healed. Well, now I can preach it. So Jesus shows up at the epicenter of the oppression of the poor and the afflicted and the crippled. He shows up in the epicenter of that, and he doesn't pick a mildly sick person with maybe a sore neck. He picks the sickest person in the whole place, paralyzed for 38 years, and he's like, what's the matter, bro? The water don't work for you? And the guy's like, Rabbi, the guy with a sore throat always jumps in first, right? And then without the help of stirred water, Jesus heals that man as a public confrontation to the oppression. In other words, the God I am revealing never charges people for healing. You can sit here the rest of your life and pay the fee, or you can understand that you can embrace something for free. This is an in-your-face confrontation to the oppressed. So he tells me the story, right? And here's my question. Everybody knows this? He said, Shane, I'm in my mid-60s. I teach PhD level history at the university. In my entire life, I have never considered one time that anybody ever thought that was the angel of our God. Just because of where it is. And he said, it's so obvious, I don't even include it on the tour. I said, bro, you might ought to consider including that one on the tour. I said, but seriously, like, I realize you live here your whole life, but he said, Shane, I don't even know how to tell you how obvious it is, right? The picture that's on the screen right now, right? You see that shadow? You see where it ends, like right there? And see that yellow plaque? Right? You can't read it, can you? Right? I knew that. So I blew it up. Let me show you what it says. Next slide. Still can't read it. Just trust me. It says, well, you can read it off the TV, I can tell you. It says Temple of Serapis. It's on a plaque. In the middle of the pool. Everybody knows this. It gets worse. Next to the plaque was a billboard. Let me show you the billboard. Next slide. See at the top there it says Bethesda? See right next to it it says what? John chapter 5? And here's Bethesda. And what does that say right there? Pagan medicinal bath. Pagan medicinal bath. It's on a billboard next to a plaque in the middle of the pool. Everybody knows this. Which leads me to this question. If we were wrong about Bethesda, what else could we be wrong about? Maybe we need to open more conversations about God instead of closing them. Because Bethesda is actually one of the greatest stories in the Bible. And it's a story I avoided for most of my preaching life. Because it was just too awful. And the reason I thought it was awful is because I didn't understand the history underneath it. Which leads me to a few questions. Because great sermons aren't meant to be agreed with nor disagreed with. Next slide. Is there anything driving us that we need deliverance from? I'm not concerned with are you forgiven tonight. I acknowledge that. I embrace it. It's important. And you should embrace that. But what about something that's driving us? Is there any place, what are we doing to help free others from their slavery? Are we actively participating in the confrontation of oppression in our world? Because that's what Christ-centered community is supposed to do. Maybe we can say it this way. Next slide. Where do we need salvation for our house today? Not someday. Here. Now. Today. So, my brothers and sisters, anytime I speak, I want Jesus to get bigger, the cross to work better, the resurrection to be central, and scriptures to get bigger, not smaller. I hope that happened for you tonight. May we be people who stay committed to building a Christ-centered community of love. What does that mean? It means we acknowledge all of life as a gift, and since we treat it as we don't deserve, we intentionally treat people as they are worth and never as they deserve. And how do we do that? When we see a need, and we know we can meet the need, we open our splachnas on the need. And may we be the source. Christianity's worldview is suffering has its place, but hope always flows through it. How? You. Me. May we be people who embrace the side of Jesus that confronted oppression everywhere he saw it. May we be the people who walk in, and when we see oppression, we can't help ourselves but to make it right. May we be those people. Because we're not just called to proclaim the forgiveness of sins, although we embrace that. We're also called to proclaim freedom from the oppressed. May we be those people. Freedom for the oppressed, for the whole world. Thanks so much. Let me be a part of your night. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. After we're done here, if you would like some resources, there's some really good stuff over there. It'll change the way you look at God. It'll also help me feed, clothe, shelter, educate mentally handicapped kids. Okay? If you know you do not want anything, God bless you. I'll see you next time, okay? I'm sure I'll come back at some point.